She stopped her car in a thunderstorm to help a pregnant stranger. She had no idea who that woman really was, or what it would cost the man hunting for her.
Diane Foster had exactly $40 in her checking account and a stranger's blood on the passenger seat of her Buick when the state trooper finally arrived. And even then, soaked to the bone on the shoulder of Route 9 at 2 in the morning, she still did not know the name of the woman she had just saved, or whose child she was about to help bring into the world, or that in 11 days a dying man 300 miles away would look at a photograph of her face and begin to weep. All she knew, in that moment, was that the girl beside her had stopped screaming, and that the silence was somehow worse than the screaming had been. This is the story of what happens when the smallest act of decency collides with the largest secrets a family can keep, and how one woman with nothing left to give ended up changing everything. 3 days earlier, Diane's life looked like the kind of quiet defeat that nobody writes songs about. She was 58 years old, a widow for 6 of those years, and the owner of a diner outside Millhaven, Ohio that had been losing money since the highway bypass opened and pulled the truckers away from her door. Her husband Raymond had built the place with his own hands in 1994, and when the cancer took him, she had promised herself she would never let it close, not because it made sense financially, but because closing it felt like agreeing that he had never existed at all. She worked 6 days a week, flipped eggs at dawn, counted registered drawers at midnight, and told herself that dignity was still worth something even when the bank statement said otherwise. Her daughter Emily had begged her to sell the diner and move closer to the city, closer to family, closer to help. Diane always changed the subject. She was not the kind of woman who accepted help easily, and she had spent so many years being the one who showed up for other people that she had genuinely forgotten how to be on the receiving end of anything. That stubbornness, that refusal to walk past someone in trouble, was about to be tested in a way she never could have imagined, on a stretch of dark highway she had driven 1,000 times before without incident. The storm rolled in from the west just after 10 that night, the kind of Ohio thunderstorm that turns the road into a river and swallows headlights whole. Diane was driving home from a supplier meeting 2 towns over, tired, replaying numbers in her head, when her high beams caught the shape of a car pulled crooked onto the shoulder, hazards blinking weakly through the rain. She almost drove past. She has said since that something about the angle of the car, tilted like it had been abandoned mid-thought, made her slow down instead. When she rolled her window down, she heard it before she saw it. A woman's voice, ragged and afraid, calling out into the storm for anyone at all. The woman's name was Maya, and she could not have been older than 26. She was 8 months pregnant, alone, and shaking so hard that at first Diane thought it was only the cold. Her car had hydroplaned into the guardrail an hour earlier, and her phone had shattered in the impact, and in the pitch dark of a rural highway with no houses for miles. She had simply been waiting, growing more frightened by the minute, for someone to stop who did not mean her harm. When Diane finally got close enough to see her clearly, she noticed the bruising along Maya's wrist, old and yellowing beneath the new fear, and she understood immediately that this young woman had been running from something long before the storm ever caught up with her. Diane got her into the Buick without a second thought, cranked the heat, and started toward the hospital in Millhaven, 22 minutes away on a good night and closer to 40 on a night like this one. She was 6 minutes into that drive when Maya gasped and grabbed the door handle so hard her knuckles went white, and Diane realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the contractions were not Braxton Hicks, and they were not spaced out, and this baby had decided that tonight, of all nights, was the night it intended to arrive. There would be no making it to the hospital. There would only be the shoulder of Route 9, the hazard lights, and whatever Diane Foster remembered from raising 2 children of her own 30 years earlier. What happened over the next 40 minutes has since been described by the responding paramedics as nothing short of remarkable. Diane talked Maya through every contraction in the calm, steady voice she used to use calming down drunk truckers at 2 in the morning, The voice of a woman who had spent 30 years learning that panic never fed anyone or fixed anything. She used a clean apron from her trunk, a leftover from a catering job, and the flashlight app on a phone with 11% battery left. When the baby finally came, small and furious and impossibly loud against the sound of the storm, Diane wrapped him in her own coat because there was nothing else dry left in the car, and she held him against Maya's chest and said the same 4 words she had said to her own children decades before. "You are safe now." In the middle of it all, Diane made a decision that she would later describe as pure instinct rather than anything resembling courage. Maya, mid-contraction, kept apologizing over and over, as though her body's own labor were some kind of inconvenience she owed a stranger an explanation for. And Diane finally stopped her cold, gripping both of her hands and telling her that nobody in this car was allowed to apologize for being alive. It was such a small exchange, barely 10 seconds long, but Maya has said in the years since that it was the first time in longer than she could remember that another human being had looked at her without a flicker of judgment underneath the concern. That single sentence, more than the blanket or the flashlight or even the ride itself, was the moment she decided she could trust this stranger completely. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes later, guided in by the trooper who had been flagged down by a passing trucker. Maya and the baby, a boy she would later name Theo, were taken to Millhaven General, and both were declared healthy, if exhausted, by sunrise. Diane drove home alone in a coat that no longer smelled like hers, changed out of clothes she would later throw away entirely, and was back behind the diner counter by 6 that morning because the eggs did not know that she had just delivered a baby on the side of a highway, and neither did the mortgage. She assumed, reasonably, that this was where the story ended. A strange, unforgettable night, a good deed done, a life returned to normal. She had no idea it was only the beginning. What Diane did not know that night, and would not learn for several more days, was exactly who Maya was running from. Maya's husband, Preston Callahan, was the only son of Walter Callahan, a man whose name appeared on manufacturing plants across 4 states and whose net worth had been estimated by regional business journals at well over $200 million. Preston had courted Maya 5 years earlier with the kind of overwhelming attention that felt, in the beginning, like devotion, and had only revealed its true shape slowly, over years, as isolation dressed up as protection and control dressed up as love. By the time Maya understood what she had married into, she was financially dependent, socially cut off from her own family, and, finally, pregnant with a child she was terrified to raise inside that house. The years leading up to that night had worn Maya down in ways that were never visible from the outside, which was precisely how Preston preferred it. He had never once raised a hand to her in public, never made a scene in front of colleagues or friends, and to nearly everyone who knew the Callahan family, he appeared to be a devoted, if intense, husband. The truth lived in smaller, quieter cruelties. The phone he insisted on monitoring for her own safety. The friendships he slowly discouraged until they simply stopped existing. The way he controlled every account in her name while telling her it was because he wanted to protect her from having to worry about money. By the time she was pregnant with Theo, Maya had come to understand that the walls closing in around her had been built one reasonable-sounding sentence at a time, which is exactly what made them so difficult to explain to anyone who had not lived inside them. Walter Callahan, for his part, was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a proud one, and pride had made him complicit in ways he would spend the rest of his life trying to undo. He had seen the warning signs in his son for years and told himself they were not his business, that a marriage was between 2 people, that Maya was simply sensitive, that Preston had always been intense but never dangerous. He believed these things the way people believe the stories that let them keep sleeping at night, right up until the afternoon 3 weeks before the storm, when Maya finally vanished from the Callahan estate with nothing but a packed bag and a note that said she was done waiting for someone to protect her. Walter had hired investigators immediately, not out of love for Maya exactly, but out of something more complicated: guilt, fear for the grandchild he had never met, and the slow, dawning horror of a 71-year-old man recently diagnosed with a failing heart who had begun, for the first time in his life, to genuinely fear what he would leave behind. He did not want his legacy to be a son who controlled and frightened the mother of his only grandchild. He wanted, desperately, and perhaps too late, to make something right before his body ran out of time to let him. When his investigators traced Maya to Millhaven General Hospital 11 days after the birth, they did not find her alone. They found her recovering in a hospital room with a woman named Diane Foster asleep in the visitor's chair beside her, because Maya, with no family of her own nearby and no one else in the world she trusted, had asked Diane to stay. The two women had grown close in those 11 days in a way that surprised them both. Diane had visited every single day after her diner shifts, bringing soup in mason jars and secondhand baby clothes she'd picked up at the church resale shop, not because anyone asked her to, but because she recognized something in Maya's eyes that reminded her, uncomfortably, of her own early widowhood. The particular loneliness of a person who has just survived something and does not yet know how to carry the weight of having survived it. Maya had no mother of her own living, no sisters, no one who understood what it meant to hold a newborn and feel more frightened than joyful. Diane, without ever discussing it out loud, simply became the person who showed up. There were harder days in that hospital room than most people ever hear about, days when Maya seriously considered calling Preston, convincing herself that the isolation of new motherhood without family nearby was worse than whatever she had left behind. On one of those days, Diane simply sat with her for hours after a full diner shift, not arguing, not lecturing, just quietly present, until Maya finally admitted out loud what she had never said to anyone: that she was terrified of raising Theo alone, and even more terrified of raising him inside a house where he might grow up believing that control was the same thing as love. Diane told her, in the plainest terms she had, that fear was a perfectly reasonable response to what she had survived, but that fear was not the same thing as a good reason to go back. It was Diane, in fact, who convinced Maya to finally call a domestic violence advocate rather than return to the Callahan estate out of guilt or exhaustion, and it was Diane who sat beside her, holding baby Theo, while Maya gave her first full statement to a caseworker about the years of control and isolation she had endured. Diane never once suggested Maya owed her anything for the night on the highway. She simply kept showing up, the way she had shown up for every stranded customer, every broke trucker, every lonely regular who had ever sat at her counter over 3 decades, because showing up was the only language of love Diane Foster had ever fully trusted. When Walter Callahan's investigators finally located Maya, they also, almost as an afterthought, mentioned the waitress who had been visiting daily, the one who had delivered the baby on the roadside, the one hospital staff described as fiercely protective of a young woman who was, by blood, still a Callahan. Walter asked to see a photograph. What he saw was not, at first glance, anything remarkable. An older woman in a faded diner apron, laughing at something off camera, one arm around his grandson. But something about her face stopped him cold, and it took him a full minute of staring at the photo to understand why. Diane Foster had gone to high school with Walter's late wife, Caroline, 40 years earlier in a town neither of them had lived in since. More than that, in a coincidence that felt, to Walter, like something closer to fate than chance, Diane's late husband Raymond had once, decades before either of them married anyone else, worked a single summer as a young mechanic on the Callahan family's original manufacturing floor, back when Walter's father still ran the company out of a converted barn. Walter remembered him, vaguely, as a serious, hard-working young man who never complained and always stayed late. He had not thought of that summer in 30 years. Sitting in his study with a photograph of Diane Foster in his shaking hands, he found himself thinking of very little else. Before making the trip himself, Walter spent nearly a full week doing something he had rarely done in decades of running a company built on delegation. He handled the research personally. He read every report his investigators produced about Diane Foster twice over, learned about Raymond's death from cancer, learned about the diner's shrinking margins since the bypass opened, learned that she had quietly covered the cost of meals for stranded truckers more times than her own accountant could count. Somewhere in the middle of that week, sitting alone in a house far larger than any one grieving man needed, Walter admitted to himself that he envied her, not her circumstances, but the plain, uncomplicated certainty with which she seemed to move through the world, helping people simply because they needed it and asking nothing in return. Walter Callahan arrived in Millhaven 8 days later, not with lawyers, not with a driver, but alone, in a rented sedan, dressed like a man trying very hard not to look like what he was. He found Diane's diner on a Tuesday afternoon during the slow hour between lunch and dinner, and he sat at the counter, and he ordered coffee, and he did not tell her who he was for nearly 20 minutes. He simply watched her work, watched the easy way she moved between tables, the way she remembered every regular's order without writing it down, the way she teased an elderly customer about his cholesterol while refilling his coffee anyway. When he finally introduced himself, Diane's first reaction was not excitement or awe. It was suspicion. She had heard enough about the Callahan name from Maya to know exactly what kind of family Theo had nearly been raised inside. Walter did not come to Millhaven to buy anyone's forgiveness, though he understood, sitting across from Diane in a cracked vinyl booth, that forgiveness was not something a checkbook could purchase no matter how large the number written on it. He came instead to say something he had never said to anyone in his adult life, which was simply that he had failed, that his pride had cost his daughter-in-law years of fear, and that a stranger with a diner apron and $40 in her checking account had done in a single stormy night what he, with all his wealth and all his resources, had failed to do in 5 years. She had made Maya feel safe. He told Diane, plainly and without theatrics, that he did not know how to repay that, but that he intended to spend whatever time his failing heart had left trying. What followed over the next several months was not the fairy tale ending a lesser story might promise, and Diane, to her credit, resisted every early attempt Walter made to simply hand her money as though gratitude were a transaction that could be closed out and forgotten. She turned down his first offer, a 6-figure check delivered by courier, without hesitation, telling him flatly that she had not saved Maya's life to be paid for it. What she did accept, weeks later and only after long conversations, was something closer to partnership. Walter, through the family's charitable foundation, quietly paid off the remaining note on her diner, not as a gift, but structured as a permanent community grant honoring Raymond Foster's original 1994 build, a gesture that let Diane keep her pride intact while finally releasing her from the debt that had haunted her for 6 years. The confrontation between Walter and his son, when it finally came, was not the dramatic scene a lesser story might stage for effect. It happened quietly, in Walter's study, over the course of a single evening, and it consisted mostly of Walter asking questions he had spent 5 years avoiding and refusing, for the first time in Preston's life, to accept the smooth, reasonable-sounding answers his son had always been so skilled at providing. Preston tried, at first, to frame the entire situation as Maya's instability, then as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, then finally, when neither story held, as something closer to the truth delivered without remorse. Walter has said since that it was in that last version, the one where his son showed no remorse at all, that he finally understood exactly how much damage his own years of looking away had allowed to happen. Preston Callahan, for his part, did not escape the consequences of the years he had spent controlling and isolating his wife. Faced with a documented pattern of abuse, a formal police report, and a father no longer willing to shield him out of pride, Preston lost far more than his marriage. Walter restructured the family trust to ensure Theo's inheritance flowed directly around his father's control, appointed independent guardians to oversee the boy's welfare, and made it unmistakably clear, in front of the family's own attorneys, that loyalty to his son would no longer come before the safety of the people his son was supposed to protect. It was not vengeance exactly. It was simply, finally, a father choosing accountability over comfortable denial, 11 days too late for some things, but not too late for everything. The most meaningful change, though, was not financial at all, and anyone who has ever actually watched Diane Foster's life since that storm will tell you the same thing. Maya did not disappear back into a world of wealth and forget the woman who had pulled her off a dark highway. She stayed in Millhaven for nearly a year, renting a small house 2 streets from Diane's diner, close enough that Theo spent as many afternoons in Diane's kitchen learning to crack eggs as he did anywhere else. Diane became, by everyone's quiet agreement, and without a single legal document required to make it true, the closest thing to a grandmother that boy would ever know on either side of his complicated family tree. Walter Callahan, before his heart finally gave out 14 months later, made sure of one more thing: that Diane Foster would always, for the rest of her life, have a standing invitation to be present for every birthday, every milestone, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon that mattered. What makes this story worth telling is not the money, though the money mattered, and it is not the coincidence of 2 families crossing paths on a dark highway 40 years after they had first, unknowingly, brushed against each other in a different life. What makes it worth telling is the plain, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath it. That Diane Foster stopped her car that night for exactly the same reason she had spent 30 years staying open late for stranded truckers and refilling coffee for lonely widowers who had nowhere else to sit. She was not looking for a reward. She did not know who Maya was, did not know what family she belonged to, did not know that a dying billionaire 300 miles away would eventually weep at a photograph of her face. She only knew that a frightened stranger needed help, and that some people, when they see that kind of need, simply cannot drive past it. If you have made it this far into Diane's story, you already understand something about yourself worth sitting with for a moment. The people who stop on dark roads for strangers, the people who show up day after day for no reward beyond the knowledge that they did the right thing, they rarely think of themselves as remarkable while they are doing it. Diane certainly never did. She still runs that diner today, still flips eggs at dawn, still refuses most forms of charity aimed at herself even now. But she keeps one photograph taped beside the register, of a newborn boy wrapped in her old coat on the worst storm of the year, and she tells anyone who asks that it is still the proudest night of her life, more than any dollar amount attached to what came after. Before we close this story out, I want to hear from you directly, because stories like this one only mean something if we let them change how we move through our own lives. Have you ever stopped for a stranger and had it turn into something you never expected, good or hard, or both at once? Write it in the comments below, because these stories deserve to be told too. And this community has always shown up for each other in exactly the way Diane showed up for Maya on that highway. If this story moved you even a little, consider subscribing, because we tell true stories like this one every single week, stories about the quiet, unglamorous decency that still exists in the world even when it feels harder and harder to find. Diane Foster did not set out to change anyone's life that night. She just refused to look away. Maybe that is the whole lesson. News of what happened on Route 9 eventually made its way beyond Millhaven, first through a small piece in the regional paper, then through word of mouth among the trucking community who had always considered Diane's diner something close to a second home. Truckers who had eaten at her counter for 20 years began stopping by specifically to shake her hand, some of them driving considerably out of their way to do it, and more than one left cash in the tip jar with a note thanking her for reminding them why they still believed in stopping for strangers themselves. Diane found the attention uncomfortable in ways she rarely admitted out loud, insisting to anyone who would listen that she had done nothing that any decent person would not have done in her place. Most of her regulars, quietly, disagreed and kept coming back anyway, not for the story, but for the woman who had always made them feel like they mattered long before anyone outside Millhaven knew her name. Theo Callahan turns 3 years old this spring, and by every account he calls Diane's diner his second home, sitting on the same counter stool where his mother once sat as a frightened stranger receiving a bowl of soup she never asked for and desperately needed anyway. Maya, for her part, has since gone back to school, is training to become a domestic violence advocate herself, and has said publicly, more than once, that the version of herself who existed before that storm feels almost like a different person entirely, someone she remembers but no longer recognizes. She credits Diane with more than saving her life on a highway. She credits her with showing her, patiently, and without ever asking for anything in return, what it actually looks like to be safe. There is one more detail about that night on Route 9 worth sitting with before this story ends. Something Diane herself did not learn until nearly a year later, when Walter finally shared it with her over coffee at her own counter. The trucker who had flagged down the state trooper that night, the one whose call ultimately brought the ambulance in time, had very nearly not stopped either. He told the responding officer, and later a local reporter, that he had already driven half a mile past Diane's hazard lights before something made him turn his rig around. He could not fully explain the impulse, only that something about seeing one car already stopped in the storm, doors open, someone clearly trying to help, made it feel unthinkable to keep driving. Diane's decision to stop, in other words, did not just save Maya and Theo. It gave one more stranger permission to do the same thing, at the exact moment it mattered most, in a chain of small decisions that could have broken at any single link and did not. And Diane, when asked by a local reporter months later why she pulled over that night, when so many other cars had already driven past a stranded car with its hazards blinking weakly into the storm, gave an answer so simple it has since been printed on a small handwritten sign taped beside her diner's register, right next to that photograph of Theo in her old coat. She said she pulled over because somebody has to. Because if everyone assumes someone else will stop, eventually no one does. Because 30 years behind a diner counter taught her that the smallest kindnesses, the ones nobody photographs or applauds, are usually the ones that end up mattering more than anything money can buy. Somewhere outside Millhaven, Ohio, on a stretch of Route 9 that looks like 1,000 other forgettable roads in America, a woman with $40 to her name once stopped her car in a thunderstorm and changed the entire direction of 3 lives without ever meaning to. She did not know, that night, that the man whose company her late husband had once worked for as a young mechanic would one day sit across from her in a cracked vinyl booth, humbled and grateful and out of time. She did not know that a frightened young woman with a shattered phone would one day stand in front of a room full of strangers, training to become the kind of advocate who helps other women find the exit she once could not find on her own. She only knew, in the moment that mattered, that someone needed help, and that walking away was never really a choice she was capable of making. That, in the end, is the only ending this story needed.